Good evening, friends, and welcome to the Million Cat Challenge webinar, Saving Cats, What Comes After a Million. Whether you're just getting off from work over here on the left coast or you're just finishing eating dinner over there on the right coast, we're glad you carved out a little time to hang out with us this evening. Before we get started, we just want to take a moment to thank our hosts this evening. Maddie's fun is not only the reason we can come together and share good news on this platform. Maddie is the reason we have good news to share. The Million Cat Challenge and much of the work we'll be celebrating tonight is made possible by their generosity and commitment to advancing animal welfare. If you weren't able to make it to Expo in May, tonight you'll get an opportunity to geek out on a little data, hear about the details of the campaign, where we scored the biggest wins, and then we'll spend a little time discussing what comes next. Our presenters tonight are Drs. Kate Hurley and Julie Levy. Most of you know Kate and Julie pretty well by now, but I'll share a little something you might not know. Their CVs are a mile long each. They have every letter of the alphabet after their names. They've been doing this for so long, their photos from their early days are Polaroid. But without question, they both consider their proudest achievement to be co-founding the Million Cat Challenge. And as Kate and Julie tonight are presenting, feel free to ask any questions that might pop up as they occur to you. We'll be collecting the questions and addressing them at the end, so you don't need to worry about interrupting. Just send them on through, and we'll gather them all up. So without further ado, I'll let Kate tell the story.
Thank you so much, Maddie, and thank you, all of you, for being here this evening. It's hard to imagine anything that would make me happier or more proud than being able to share with you what comes after we already saved over 1 million more cats. And I'll just warn you, coming up at about slide 15, you might want to have a glass of champagne or some sparkling water or some kitten milk replacer or your other favorite festive beverage on hand. But right now I'm going to take you back to before the Million Cat Challenge was even a twinkle in our eyes. And I know that some of you were there. This is 2013, and people were hungry for change for cats, and you could feel it in the air. And Dr. Levy and John Cicerelli from San Jose City Animal Care Services and I were invited to speak at the plenary session at HSUS Expo in Nashville. And this was the title of our talk, Radically Rethinking Our Response to Cats. And we shared this graph. And we were making progress. I started in 1989 when that blue bar of the number of millions of dogs and cats killed was an order of magnitude higher than it was in 2010 or 2012 when we made this presentation. So that was great news. But, and it was a big but, the progress was not the same for cats and for dogs. And on these graphs, you can see the blue bar is intake and the red bar is euthanasia. And we had complete data sets for certain states in the United States. And you could see, for instance, in Ohio, over an 8-year period, while dog euthanasia dropped dramatically, cat intake and euthanasia both rose. We saw a similar pattern in Colorado, where dog intake went down, euthanasia stayed about the same, while cat euthanasia rose dramatically in proportion to intake. And in my home state of California from 2000 to 2010, following the founding of the shelter medicine program, my completion of the residency, there's so much effort, so much work, so much progress. Cat intake and euthanasia had risen substantially, even as dog euthanasia had dropped dramatically. We weren't having the same kind of success for cats as we were for dogs, and everyone was frustrated. And here was the problem. I just picked a year from California that just exemplified what was happening. Almost 400,000 cats came into shelters, and just over 100,000 cats left those shelters alive. So there was a huge imbalance between the number of cats coming in, the capacity of the shelters in our state to provide good care for cats, and the ability to turn up the outflow to match the incoming mix of cats. And that situation was repeated throughout most of the nation. And in our slides, we shared some aha moments that really changed how we thought about cats and about the problem of cats, that really showed us how they were different from dogs. In the first graph, I hope you can see this all right on your screen. That green piece of the pie is the proportion of cats that are adopted from a shelter or a rescue. So almost 25% of the market. But then what do we see in the rest of the pie? And I'm sorry, this was supposed to be animated, but this dark piece of the pie, that's how many people get their cats as strays. And then this next blue piece of the pie is friend and relative. Next is born at home. And then this is a mix of other sources. So unlike for dogs, where we may have a demand-driven market of puppy mills, where if we grab more of the market share for shelter and rescue adoptions, perhaps we would actually decrease the purpose-bred supply. We don't have that for cats. If we increase our market share of adoption and rescue, it's not that this stray cat then suddenly won't be born or won't need a home, or this accidental litter won't happen and won't need to be rehomed. So we can grab more market share, but it doesn't address the other cats that are in need in the community in the same way that it might for dogs. On the plus side, what it also showed us is that there's already a robust network for cats to be rehomed from home to home and from community to home that is in existence. And if we can redirect some of our attention to supporting that network, maybe we can actually successfully rehome far more cats than we were doing at the time of this talk. Now going to this next graph, this was a profound realization for me. When I started as an animal control officer in 1989, one of the mandates of my shelter and one of the reasons why I understood that I was there was to help lost pets get back home. And that works really well for dogs, to pick them up, to encourage the public to bring them into shelters. Because when a dog is lost, people notice. They notice right away, and they know to potentially head down to the animal shelter. The dog doesn't hide under a bush for 6 weeks before he emerges to be found, right? But for cats, the scenario is different. A lot of times, it takes some time before the person even realizes the cat is lost. It may be a loosely owned cat that's cared for several people in the community, and so the person may assume that the cat is just hanging out at the neighbors for a little while. And also importantly, when cats get lost, oftentimes they don't get found right away because they are often scared or stuck in a shed or hiding because they were startled. And so there's a mismatch between when people are looking for cats in shelters and when cats actually are in shelters. And so what that means is this little green piece of the pie is cats that are reunited with their family through a call or a visit to the shelter. And all the rest of these methods have to do with cats that are reunited in their families by staying in the neighborhood where they were lost. And in fact, this huge dark piece of the pie is cats that just returned home on their own. And so what that told us is that actually by allowing people to bring healthy cats into the shelter, we were potentially reducing their chances of ever being reunited with their families. On the other hand, there's good news again here. There's already a robust system that we can support to help cats be reunited with their owners by informing people in the community about how they can best make those matches happen and informing owners about how they can most successfully search for their lost cats. And then this final graph, Cats in Communities, U.S. 2013, this was really the huge news that told us why our methods for dogs were not working as well as they were for cats. Now let me go through this in a little bit of detail. This light blue piece of the pie you see here is pet cats that are allowed outside. The dark blue piece of the pie, over half of the circle, is community cats that are unowned, that are roaming out and about. And that together makes up all of the cats that are out and about in our communities. Now with dogs, there's no big dark blue piece of the pie of unowned community dogs. And that means that our programs directed with the assumption that pets have owners work well for dogs. When we have low-cost spay-neuter, we have an owner to take advantage of that. When we have legislation that says that pets must be confined, we have an owner to obey that legislation and put their dog on a leash or put up a fence. When we say that adoption or return to the owner are the positive outcomes available to an animal, well, that's going to be appropriate for the vast majority of dogs. But that's not true for cats. Most cats don't have an owner to drive them to a low-cost spay-neuter clinic, and so for those cats, we need TNR as a solution. Many cats that are coming in, we can hold them for as long a stray period as we like, but there is no owner out there to ever reclaim that cat, no matter how many free microchips we offer. And the assumption even that adoption or return to owner are the only positive outcome available leaves out feral cats or cats that might not be suited to a traditional pet home, but in fact were doing fine in the community where they already were. And then these final pieces of pie, this little green sliver, is the proportion of cats that were being impounded to shelters and released alive on an annual basis at the time. And then this final red piece of pie was cats impounded and euthanized. And that is a drop in the bucket. This is on an annual basis. And when you divide this by 365 days in a year and compare that to all the cats out and about in communities every single day, that amounted to approximately 1 in 15,000 cats being impounded and euthanized. And what we know about cats is that the other 14,999 cats remaining in communities are going to replace that one cat in a hot second. And initially, that might seem really depressing because all that effort, all that work, all that sorrow that we poured into this method of managing cats really can't be expected to touch the magnitude of the problem. But on the other hand, this is incredibly freeing, right? It's a drop in the bucket. And if we take that drop out of the bucket, it's not going to change anything for the number of cats out and about in communities, but it's going to change everything for the cats that do come into shelters, and it's also going to change everything about how we think about serving this vast majority, how we reach the other 14,999 cats that are still out there at risk and need our attention. And so what we saw was, with that realization, opening all kinds of doors, knowing that cats are going to get adopted out in communities. If people want a cat, they're going to get a cat. And the only decision we need to make is, are they going to get a cat from us through an open adoption process with no barriers and a lot of fun at a kitten palooza, or are they going to get an intact cat from a neighbor down the street that might continue to contribute to the problems that we see in our communities? It's okay, suddenly, when someone finds a healthy stray cat, to just tell them, hey, why don't you knock on some doors and put up some signs and see if you can't get that cat back home rather than bringing it into the shelter. It's okay to have a waiting list. There is already cats out and about in the community. Bringing one more cat in today than we can care for, we have room for, we have a positive outcome for, is not going to solve that problem, but it's going to have a huge impact on our system. And then what we found out is that when we started thinking about cats differently, the public responded much more positively than we ever could have imagined. And what we saw emerge from this were solutions that were specific to cats. We recognize that cats aren't just bossy little dogs that knock everything off of every counter in our homes, right? They're different. There's this unowned population that we have to address. There's a feral population that we have to provide live outcomes for that are different than traditional adoptive homes. And it also gave us tools for holistic solutions that didn't just address the outcome side of the equation, but also addressed various methods of reducing intake, not just in the long run through targeted spay-neuter programs, but also in the short run by providing positive alternatives, by giving people kitten milk replacer to keep kittens out of the shelter, by talking to people about alternative ways to deal with a community cat that was creating a nuisance for them. And with all of these specific and holistic solutions in mind, we challenged the people who were at the conference that day, who were in the audience, about 2,000 of them. We passed out these little cards with the silhouette of a cat on them. And some of you in the audience today, I know, filled out one of those cards. And if you have it, I hope you'll send me a photograph of it, because I would love to see it. This is a woman I saw at a conference who still had her card. And once we had tallied all the numbers on the cards, we added it all up, and it came to a pledge to save 131,656 more lives with what they had learned at the conference that week. And that was impressive. And Julie and I took that information home and reflected on it. And we thought, maybe there was a couple hundred shelters represented in that room. And they committed to save over 100,000 more cats. And there is well over 10 times that many shelters in North America. And so why not up that goal tenfold and just go for 1 million? And we pitched that idea to Maddie's fund. They said yes. And long story short, we gathered those specific and holistic solutions into the 5 key initiatives of the Million Cat Challenge. Tools to match inflow with the capacity for care in the shelter, and ways to turn up the outflow, both for cats that are on a path to a traditional adoptive home and for cats that belong in barn homes, working cat homes, or in the homes in the community that they already had. And honestly, it seemed like the blink of an eye. But in fact, it was 4 short years later, a whole year before we thought we would be making this announcement. And now is the time to pour your glass of bubbly or sparkling water or break out the kitten milk replacer. And I recommend you turn the volume up on your computer or your phone or your speakers as loud as it will go, and join us to hear what it was like when we actually made the announcement of how many lives had been saved.
But you, my beloved profession, you rose up from the southern tip of Florida all the way to Alaska, and you kept that promise for me 1,129,000.
Was that freaking awesome? Thumbs up. Yes.
So I'd like to take it from here and talk about some of those specific numbers that made up over 1 million cats that were saved in 4 short years. We were established with a singular goal to help shelters save the lives of 1 million cats in North America over 5 years. To track progress towards this goal, we had to track cats, a lot of them, in a lot of shelters. Every year, our shelters reported 3 key data points to us. And if you're in the shelter and you were the data person, you might know how hard we worked to get that number from you. So we counted the number of cats that a shelter took in that year, the number of live outcomes, and the number of cats that were euthanized. And these are the numbers I'm going to be sharing with you in the next few slides. The data team was relentless in pursuit of this data, and as a result, we have a remarkably complete story to tell that we'll be sharing tonight. Using 2012 as the project's baseline year, we were able to track each shelter's progress through every year. And what we're going to talk about is the progress these shelters have made through 2017. This is just a this image of a spreadsheet shows you just a tiny fraction of what our data looks like. It's pages and pages and pages of over 1 million data points. At the end of 2017, we had collected complete data for both 2012 and 2017 from over 1,000 shelters. That's 88% of our participating shelters, accounting for about 1.7 million cats that they cared for during that time. Only 94 shelters were missing data from 2012, and that was primarily because they were new. And only 60 were missing 2017, and 6 were missing both. And the point of this really is just to say that the numbers that we're going to be sharing with you tonight, we're very confident in that there's high integrity and a great story that they tell. So we have a poll question now for you, and we want you to project, what do you think was the change that made the greatest impact on saving 1 million cats? Was it decreased intake as the most important contributor? Or was there approximately equal contribution from decreased intake and increased live outcome? Or do you think it was really just live outcomes that were the most important contributor to decreased euthanasia? So click one of those options on the screen. And do the poll on the screen and not in the chat window, because your chat comments won't be counted. I'm going to give another couple seconds for this. Okay, here we go. Oh, how interesting. So we have a really split audience here with approximately equal projections that it was primarily decreased intake, equally split, or increased outcomes. So I think you're going to enjoy these stories that are coming up. So now I'm going to dig into the weeds and share some high-level work. What you're going to see here in this graph is the first column is a decrease, so a number that was decreased. The second column is the number of cats, actually. And then we have increase, and net change. So I'm going to walk you through this little bit of a spreadsheet together. So if we look at the first row, it's intake. 532 shelters experienced a decrease in intake over that time from 2012 to 2017. And similarly, a similar number of shelters actually experienced an increase of intake of 200,000 cats. But together over the whole project, total intake went down by 174,000. So pretty impressive change that these shelters were able to find better outcomes than bringing animals into the shelter. If we look at the second row in live release, we see that 262 shelters had a decrease in live release, and that was 70,000 cats, but 800 shelters had an increase in live outcomes. So these would be adoptions, return to field, return to owner, and other ways that shelters can have happy endings for their cats, and this was about 400,000 cats increase in the number of cats released alive. So between the shelters that had decreased live release and those that had increased was over 300,000 increased good outcomes. And then the last row is euthanasia. And 730 shelters out of a little over 1,000 had experienced a decrease in total euthanasia for 500,000 cats over that time. And another 273 shelters had an increase in euthanasia, but it was only 17,000. So together, again, almost 500,000 cats had a decreased euthanasia. And we have some interesting observations on a regional basis about how this balance of increased live outcome and decreased euthanasia appeared in different kinds of shelters. So taking Canada as a whole, we saw that most of their gains were actually due to decreased intake. So they had fewer cats that they had to find live outcomes from. And similarly, in this section that's called the Mountain West, the orange section, they also had primarily a decreased intake of cats coming in. And in contrast, many of the larger populated areas around the country made most of their gains by having increased live outcomes. So they were really ramping up their adoption programs and return-to-owner programs and return-to-field programs. And so here on the West Coast, we saw a big increase in live outcome. And then also where we're working here in the Southeast was the biggest change, where here in the red category we had a total decrease of 117,000 change in euthanasia that was primarily driven by an increase in live outcomes. We also had the opportunity to look at the kinds of shelters that were making change, and we looked at shelters from the very smallest, those that took in less than 500 cats a year, all the way up to the very largest, which were those that took in over 5,000 cats a year. And we saw that while a large number of our shelters, 42% of them, fell into that small group, they actually accounted for a relatively small proportion of the total cats just because they were smaller. Whereas our rare large shelters were handling the vast majority of the cats. A few shelters that were handling 5,000 cats or more had a total intake at the beginning of the project of over 600,000 cats. And over the time of the project, they were able to decrease that by 150,000. So these big shelters had a lot of room to move. We also looked at whether shelters, by their intake and funding type. So we had our private shelters that carried municipal contracts, and our municipal shelters. Again, the biggest group of shelters were those that were private shelters without contracts, and those tended to be somewhat smaller shelters. But then when we looked at the total intake numbers, we see that these blue slices of the pie, which are the municipal shelters and the private shelters with contracts, are handling the vast majority of the cats. So that brings us to our next poll question, which is, where did the most decrease in euthanasia come from? Do you think it was the private shelters that did not carry animal control contracts, private shelters that had those contracts, or municipal shelters? So which groups contributed the most to the decrease in euthanasia?
Folks, while you're taking a moment to think about and answer those poll questions, I just wanted to remind you in the bottom of your screen is a Q&A box. Feel free to send your questions over anytime. I'm over here collecting them for Kate and Julie for the end of the presentation. Feel free to submit questions anytime.
All right, we'll give you a couple more seconds to ponder this question. Okay, well, not much ambiguity here. By far, the most popular projection was that municipal shelters were responsible for most of these gains in life-saving. So we'll dig into that a little bit now. Oh, and follow-up poll question is, where did most of the increase in live release come from? So our previous poll question was, who had the most decrease in euthanasia, and this one is directed at where did most of the increase in live outcomes? Was it those private shelters without contracts, private shelters with contracts, or municipal shelters? Two-second warning. Oh, so agreement again that probably the biggest movement was coming from those municipal shelters. So we have a large number, 2/3 of the respondents are saying that municipal shelters probably accounted for most of the increase in live outcomes. So this is our graph that's looking at these changes over time in live release and euthanasia by type. The yellow slice of the pie is the private shelter without a contract, and the blue ones are animal control agencies. So the light blue is the private shelters with contracts, and the dark blue is the municipal shelters. And what we see, as you guys predicted, was that live release increased the most in municipal shelters and in shelters that had the contracts. And similarly, you nailed it, euthanasia decreased the most in municipal shelters and private shelters with contracts. And this is good news because we know that these shelters that have contracts sometimes can feel like their hands are tied in making change to help cats. And we're seeing these leadership shelters showing us how creative and tenacious they can be to improve life saving. So then we took a subset of our shelters and looked at only those shelters that decreased their euthanasia by more than half. And this was about 500 shelters. And what you're seeing on the left side of this graph is the life-saving change that has happened based on the size of the shelter. So on the left side of the graph is the very smallest shelters taking in less than 500 cats a year. And on the right side of the graph are those very large shelters that are taking in more than 5,000. And it's so happy to see that even these biggest shelters that had very high euthanasia rates, up over 50% when they started in 2012, were able to drop those in just a few years down to less than 20%. And we see a similar result over here on the right side where we're looking at these statistics based on what type of shelter they are. And we're seeing across the board again that regardless of whether they're a municipal shelter, a private shelter with a contract, or a private shelter without a contract, their euthanasia rates are plummeting. So this is a grand finale data slide that really tells the story that Kate started with the presentation at Expo in 2013 where we challenged shelters to tell us how many cats they thought they could save. And they revealed a pledge of over 100,000 cats, and then that in turn inspired us to start a national 5-year program to save more than 1 million cats. So starting in 2012, our shelters handled 1.7 million cats a year. It took in 1.7 million cats a year and released only about half of those, and nearly half of those cats were euthanized. And if swinging over to 2017, you can see that live intake has decreased somewhat by 10%, but live outcome has shot forward by 38%, and euthanasia has plummeted by an incredible 63% over that time. So the live release rate across the board in this campaign in all the shelters went from 53%, just half of cats in 2012, all the way up to 81%, or 8 out of 10 cats, in 2017. That is 1,311 fewer cats euthanized every day, or 55 fewer cats an hour, every hour of the day, every day of the year. That's truly just a remarkable statistic that everybody should be so proud of. Woo woo! And so our question is, what now? We reached 1 million cats a year early, and we knew we couldn't stop. And so after 1 million, what's the next goal? Is it zero euthanasia? We initially toyed with the idea of calling this project the Feline Euthanasia Zero Project, mostly so that Kate's cat could wear a fez. But when we really talked about it, we understood that it's not zero euthanasia that we're shooting for. We really know that for some cats, euthanasia is the right outcome, and they should have it. So what we instead started to look at is what's the risk analysis for cats in animal shelters that for whom euthanasia is not the best outcome. And a few years ago, this might be the tree of risk of cats being euthanized. Not only was it the sick and the ill cats, but it also was healthy adults and healthy kittens. And so many shelters at the time they joined the challenge really had many cats in all of these categories being euthanized. But as they've worked the Million Cat Challenge and got the low-hanging fruit under control, so their healthy adults and their healthy kittens are being saved, and their feral cats are being saved through return to field and TNR programs, and barn kitties that just don't want to live in a home are getting assigned to jobs out in the field, and even our FIV cats are now getting adopted into homes. And we're starting to see some traction on underage kittens, but boy, there's some populations that we're hearing about are still really tough nuts to crack from shelters. So those cats with chronic diseases, large number of bottle babies that come in during kitten season, the senior cats with medical issues, kitties with ringworm, and kitties with FELV. We know they can be saved, but there is a lot more effort that goes into saving these cats than there was when we were just shooting for saving all the healthy kittens. So we know the Feline Euthanasia Zero project was not the right inspiration for our next phase, despite how good Kate's cat looks in a fez. And so we started looking at other statistics. Should we have a certain percentage that we choose from? We hear 90% a lot as being a goal for shelters, but we know that if shelters are taking in just tough cases because they've solved the problems of cats coming into shelters in the first place, that they might be euthanizing more than 90%. 65% of the challengers had live release above 90%, including about half of the public shelters and contracted shelters. And a few of our biggest rock star shelters had live release below 90% because their community safety nets were so strong that all but the most dire cases were coming into the shelter. And those were cats for whom euthanasia was the right choice. So just picking an arbitrary percentage point didn't seem like the right choice. So what is it that we really wanted to do? The answer is that we really wanted to find a way to assure the right outcome for every cat that comes to every shelter. That might be going back home if it's a lost cat, being adopted if it's a socialized friendly cat, returning to the field, euthanasia for cats that were suffering and could not be treated, care for behavior problems for those cats that need it, and for many cats, it's not entering the shelter after all, that there's better outcomes for those cats than entering an institution. And so our hashtag for Million Cat Challenge 2.0 is all the cats, the right outcome for every cat at every shelter. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kate.
Thanks, Julie. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as we did. We can spend hours or days and have on these spreadsheets. And for those of you who have any questions about it or even just comments, feel free to type those into the Q&A. We look forward to tackling those at the end. So now let's get granular about what does hashtag all the cats really mean. And one thing we did is we surveyed some of the most successful challengers, those that had reduced euthanasia by 50% or more, and we asked them, hey, now that you've made so much progress, what's next for you? And this is the response that we got. It was a mix of some shelters felt pretty good about where they are for cats, and maybe they're turning their attention outwards towards helping the community or helping transfer in cats from other shelters that are still more in need. There was cats with medical concerns, underage kittens and bottle babies. Some shelters still working on just plain old healthy adult cats and kittens. Working cats and feral cats still make a pretty big group. And then the cats that are pet cats but with behavior issues. And we still need solutions that are not only holistic, that address intake and capacity within the shelter and outcomes, but we also need to get even more specific. So the solution for a 5-week-old kitten is not the same as the solution for a 12-year-old cat that pees outside the litter box. The strategy and the decision about whether to provide an alternative to intake for this kitten, the capacity that's needed in foster care, or the type of housing that's required in the shelter is going to be different for this little guy than for this one here. And so that's our commitment that we're making, is to take those 5 key initiatives that we still really believe in. We believe that that provided a really good and balanced set of tools to tackle cats and find solutions in every possible direction, and now to tailor them for the different kinds of cats that are specifically still at risk in your shelters. So we presented that at Expo as part of our live celebration, and we got this great question from someone following the Facebook feed. So if you're out there, Charlene, thank you. That's an awesome goal. But how do you plan to implement such an idealistic plan? Fair enough, right? And we came home from Expo and asked ourselves exactly that question. But here's the thing that we realized, is it's not going to come from us. It's going to come from you who are already part of the challenge. And all the cats starts with all the shelters. And we don't have them all in the challenge yet. But luckily, we do have them spanning all the way from Alaska way down here to this little pin in Puerto Rico and counting, over 1,300 shelters now. And I want to bring your attention to a link that's in the green resources under files, which is who's involved in the Million Cat Challenge. And this isn't live, so I can't show it to you right now, but if after this you go to that link and you click it, it'll give you this map. And importantly, you can scroll down and there's a little box that says filter by state. And if you type in a state, your state or a state that you're visiting, you can get a list of all the shelters for that state that are in the Million Cat Challenge. And so we're going to look to you to help us bring the rest of the shelters into the fold. And I'm getting a note to move the mic away from my mouth a little bit. So I hope that's better. Let me know if not. Now this is fascinating. Where are we now in terms of shelters in the challenge? This is a curve that some of you may have seen, and it's the innovation adoption curve. And populations tend to follow the same pattern, whether this is about adoption of new technology or a new dietary trend. There are people who jump right on board for fried kale, and there are people who really don't go until they're kicking and screaming, and that's the only thing left in the cafeteria, right? And so what we found is that this also held true for the Million Cat Challenge. About 2.5% of people are innovators. And we consider that would be the very first shelters off of whose work we built the 5 key initiatives. Then we have about 13.5% of people in general are early adopters. And check this out. Charter challengers that joined the challenge in 2014 sheltered a 13.4% of estimated U.S. sheltered cats. So their intake, which is sort of a measure of what percentage of the whole cat pie they took up, represented 13.4% of estimated cats that come into U.S. shelters, almost exactly what we would expect of the early adopter part of the curve. So we're using cat intake as a marker for the representation of shelters because some shelters are so small that if we had most of the small shelters in, we still wouldn't have most of the people and most of the cats in sheltering. I hope that makes sense. Now check this out. The shelters that joined in the next wave, all of you are in the challenge now, 2015 through 2017, represented an estimated 38% of estimated U.S. sheltered cats. So almost, again, exactly what we would expect for the early majority. So what that means is that probably you are in the challenge now are the early adopters, the ones who get on board early, the ones who are out there eating fried kale and talking on a smartphone when everybody else was using flip phones. And now where we want to go is to reach the late majority. Those shelters that are more cautious or maybe are in communities where they're not as connected, they're more isolated from some of the profession, they haven't been able to go to Expo, they're not on the newsletter lists, and they need you to reach out to them. So here's our next poll question. How are you going to help us find the other half? And please check all that apply and feel free to participate early and often. So option 1, right after this webinar, before I forget, before I put on my PJs if I'm on the East Coast, I'm going right to millioncatchallenge.org, who's involved. I'm going to find that link in the resources. And I'm going to click the drop down from my state and see what shelter I know that's not in the Million Cat Challenge yet, and I'm going to reach out to them. Or I'm going to post to my or my shelter's social media about why we joined the Million Cat Challenge and how others can get involved. And or we're going to reach out to local media to share our success as part of the Million Cat Challenge so that others can learn more and be inspired, so that shelters that don't subscribe to every newsletter on earth can just see it in the local paper and think, hey, maybe I want to get in on that. Yay! So I'm so excited to see that almost all of you are going to get right onto millioncatchallenge.org and find the shelters. And we look forward to seeing a wave of new shelters joining the Million Cat Challenge. I see also that you're going to reach out to local media and post on your social media and find other ways to share the news with other shelters. So one thing we need to do is get all the shelters on board. And the other thing that we need to do is to develop those holistic and specific strategies, not just for the healthy adoptable cats, but for some of those more difficult risk groups that we described. And again, lucky for us, we already have all the work and all the learning that you've done. And so as I mentioned, we surveyed the shelters that have dropped euthanasia the most. And we delved into the details of how they made that change. And that's posted, the link to that resource is posted also in your resources for this webinar. And where are we now in terms of really finding solutions for all those different risk groups and for all the cats that are being admitted to shelters in the United States right now? Well, estimates are that now about 860,000 cats are being euthanized yearly in the United States. And as Julie mentioned, euthanasia has already decreased on an annual basis by about 450,000 cats at U.S. Million Cat Challenge shelters. So if this whole arrow was the amount by which we need to reduce euthanasia, we have gotten already about a third of the way there. So how are you going to help us get to the other two-thirds of the cats that are still dying in U.S. shelters? So again, feel free to choose all of the above. You can go right now to millioncatchallenge.org, get involved, newsletter, and sign up for the newsletter. And that link also is in the resources. So if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, do that now so you can hear what we've got planned. If you're with a Challenger shelter and you haven't already, email right now, #allthecats, millioncatchallenge.org to join the discussion group today. Share your successes. Share your challenges. Let us help, and let us help you share the good work that you're doing. If you're already in the discussion group, make a promise to get 2 more team members to join and post something great in the next month, either a great question or a great answer. And if you haven't already, join the Million Cat Coalition and Shelter Animals Count so that we can continue to track the great work that you're doing. So I hope to see lots of all of the above. All right. Fantastic. And I see especially that almost half of you are going to go sign up for the newsletter, and I hope that's because the other half of you have already signed up. That's something that anybody can do to stay involved with the Million Cat Challenge. So bottom line, if you haven't joined the Million Cat Challenge, join. If you haven't subscribed to the newsletter, subscribe. If you're not in the discussion group, join. If you haven't joined Shelter Animals Count, get involved, spread the news, and be part of what's next when we really get to all the cats every single one the right care and the right outcome for every single shelter in every community in North America. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Julie. I just love watching that video again, and I love seeing the stats of how many cats per hour are being saved. Makes me a little teary all over again. Okay, straight to questions. We know it's getting late, so we want to get right on it. Julie, you're first up. Ms. Kim wants to know, do we have any way to know whether intake decreased 10% over 5 years, mainly because of managed intake, return to field, or is any of it due to educating the public to recover lost and stray cats before they end up at shelters?
We did survey our shelters that decreased intake and euthanasia the most, and we got some clues about what they thought were the biggest impacts. And it does have to do with increasing intake primarily by providing better alternatives to intake in the community. But it seemed to require some very direct assistance. So it's more than education, but it is actually providing those kitten care kits and providing the TNR and providing care to keep them in the home. So the safety nets have to be pretty strong to have these kinds of results.
Wonderful. And Kim also wants to know, what's the best link to invite or send shelter directors who are not aware of the Million Cat Challenge? Kate?
I would say for shelters, millioncatchallenge.org, but also always email us at info@millioncatchallenge.org.
Or hashtag all the cats. We have a fancy new email as well. That's right. All right, Julie, we have one more for you. Ms. Joyce wants to know, isn't an increase in live release also counted as a decrease in euthanasia? I'm confused about the metrics.
And it is confusing, and we definitely don't want to count our statistics twice because we're actually trying to be very conservative about our estimates for life saving so that we don't overstate our success. And so what we did was we looked at shelters and we calculated their decrease in euthanasia or their increase in live outcome, and we picked only one of those. So we did not count animals twice. So if a shelter really achieved most of its goals by improving live outcomes, that's the number we pick. If they achieved most of their gains by a decrease in euthanasia, that's what we pick. But if you think about it, think about a shelter that's taking in a lot of animals and they find alternatives to intake. Euthanasia is going to go down because of that decrease in intake. In other shelters, they may have the same intake or even higher intake, but because they really open up the outflow to live outcomes through increasing euthanasia or better return to owner programs, those will achieve most of their gains through improving their live outcomes, which reduces the euthanasia.
That's right. Kate? Sandy wants to know, where did you get the number that 860,000 cats are euthanized annually if you don't have all the shelters in your program? Just curious.
That's
how
a great
you came
question.
Out with the number, isn't it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because not all the shelters are in the Million Cat Challenge, so there's not 860,000 cats still being euthanized in Million Cat Challenge shelters. That's an aggregate number from the national organizations that have used data from Shelter Animals Count, from statewide databases that are available, and then extrapolated from those statewide databases to shelters that may not be represented to come up with that estimated number.
Thank you, Kate. Kate, Amanda's wondering, I know we've registered for the challenge before, but for some reason we're not on the Challenger map. I looked earlier today and my agency is missing. Oh, we hate hearing that.
Oh, we do hate hearing that, Amanda, and I even remember the name Vanderburg Humane Society. And every once in a while our map program fails us and puts shelters somewhere out in East Croatia. So just email us at info@millioncatchallenge.org and we'll get that sorted out. We're sorry.
Absolutely.
We'll send you a special pin and postcard with your shelter on the map.
We will. Kate, Lisa's wondering, Our local shelter has changed many policies which have negative impacts. For example, they got rid of spay the mom. When someone brings in kittens, they used to spay the mom for free. Reclaim was cut, so you can no longer collect a cat that was surrendered, etc. Do you think reclaim is a good step change for saving lives?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Obviously, our first choice is to help people keep a cat that they're thinking they might have to surrender if there's any way that they can successfully just maintain that human-animal bond. But we always want to be open to any live outcome available for a cat. And it sounds like maybe the local shelter could benefit from joining the Million Cat Challenge. No shelter that I've ever encountered wants to euthanize more cats, and a lot of times when there's policies that seem like they're negative or misguided, it comes down to either a lack of resources or a lack of knowledge. And so I encourage you to let them know about the Million Cat Challenge, encourage them to join, encourage them to reach out for help.
Absolutely. Kate, Kathleen's wondering, we hear save them all, 90% live release rate, and no kill. How do we counteract with that message that we want the best outcome for all the, I love this question already, we want the best outcome for all the cats, even if it is euthanasia? Thank you for that question, Kathleen.
Yeah, and I think we've written about this in the Million Cat Challenge blog, so if you search the blog for #AllTheCats, I think you'll find our discussion of what that really means to us, and that's why we decided on the more complex and more nuanced message for the Million Cat Challenge. That said, I think sometimes what the public needs to know is a simple message that no kill can represent, that save them all can represent, that 90% live release rate can represent, which is a recognition that euthanasia sometimes is a humane choice, and we don't want to take that off the table. But when we talk about any of those sort of shorthands for save them all or #AllTheCats, when we don't have time to get into the details of about exactly what that means, I think the public really does understand. And a simple message, as you've described, is we are committed to the best outcome for all the cats, including euthanasia, to relieve suffering that can be remedied any other way.
Excellent. Julie, there was a slide with 5 initiatives that passed by too quickly. Pop quiz, quick. Can you state what they are?
Yes, I can. We have alternatives to intake. So lots of times going to the shelter is not the very best thing that can happen to a cat. We also have managed admission, which is controlling the inflow of cats for a time when the shelter is best able to deal with them. So for an example of that would be kitten programs where the people who find underage kittens raise them up until their adoption age and then bring them to the shelter rather than dumping a bottle baby on the shelter. Then we have capacity for care, which is really about assuring that we're meeting all of the needs of every cat in the shelter and that they're not suffering with crowding or disease or long lengths of stay that can be avoided. And that's where our portalizing campaigns come in. Then we have return to field programs, which for those cats that are thriving in the community, they can be neutered and returned to their original neighborhood where they were thriving. And it's just a slight nuanced twist on regular trap, neuter, return programs where cats are neutered and returned without going to the shelter. But this is for shelter cats that can be returned back to their homes. And then finally, removing barriers to adoption. This is so important that we recognize that lots of people want cats and we need to help them have them. And maybe be a little bit less uptight about trying to judge who is going to be a good cat owner and who is going to provide cats with good homes. We have people that are making the right choice to come to the shelter in the first place, and so let's help them have a successful relationship.
Absolutely. Julie, do you have a favorite initiative? You can't love
I think I do. They're always the favorite when I'm working on them and working with the shelter to implement them because they have such happy outcomes. I think the really easy one for a quick change is to evaluate adoption programs and start looking at the public as an ally rather than a threat, because that is very rewarding to bring people into your shelter. And I think the one that can have the biggest, most dramatic impact on life outcomes overnight is fully embracing a return to field program.
Absolutely. Kate, if you had to pick one.
If I had to pick one?
I know it's hard.
Actually, we asked in the survey which was the one that changed everything, and the survey respondents were almost evenly balanced between all of them. And so I'm not going to pick one. I'm going to say the favorite one is the one that works for your shelter, and that's the beauty of the 5 initiatives.
It is, and how they can work together or independently, and they can meet you where you are when you're ready. Okay, anybody have a few more questions? Send them now. We're getting to the bottom of the list, and then we just have a couple announcements. Julie, this one's for you. Kim would love to hear what Julie has to say about the latest on the long-term studies of contraceptive vaccines for cats. Might this be an option to spay and neuter within the next 5 years?
Oh, that's my favorite option of all the initiatives, is initiative number 6, which is a pill or a shot that can replace surgery. And I'm giggling a little bit because I see that Joyce Briggs is on this call, and she is the founder and executive director of the Alliance for Contraception in Cats and Dogs. They have an absolutely a comprehensive and fantastic website where you can stay up to date with all of the latest developments in alternatives to surgical contraception or surgical sterilization on an international level. And they just finished up a conference, and the conference notes are available. So, sadly, though, for those of us who have been waiting for something a little more practical and hauling cats around to surgery clinics, there is nothing on the near horizon for cats that I'm aware of. We have tried a lot of different approaches, and they all started out promising, and then when we really put them to the test in big studies, we found weaknesses that made them not attractive to roll out for community cats, or cats in general, but certainly for community cats. And as a person who funds and works for a volunteer community cat program, I am really waiting for the day when I can get my weekends back, because we've had an alternative, and I can just send my volunteers out in the field with a packet of vaccines they give in the trap. So stay tuned. Check out the Alliance for Contraception in Cats and Dogs and support that work they're doing, because one day, and I'm sure it's going to be in my lifetime, I'm going to be able to say, remember when we used to cut cats open for population control? That seems really barbaric now. Thank God we don't have to do it anymore.
Oh, great answer. Kate, that's how Julie will know when we're there. How will you know when we've reached all the cats?
When somebody emails me about hashtag all the rabbits.
And Julie has a weekend off to talk to you about that. All right, we have a few announcements, but Kate and Julie, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we make them?
I just saw another question come in from the Sacramento SPCA. Do we have time to field that one?
Oh, we do. Let's see here.
I'll just field this one. What is your stance on adopting friendly cats to outdoor-only homes, and how do we share that information with our team? And as you've probably already gathered, our stance in general is that people are going to get cats if they want cats, and if they want an outdoor cat, they're going to get an outdoor cat from some source. And if we can encourage them through a welcoming and open adoption process to get a cat from us, from a shelter, we have the opportunity to build a relationship with that person, to give them some guidance maybe about how to have a outdoor cat and have it be as safe as possible, how to select a cat that's going to be a good candidate and a robust cat to be happy and contented and safe in an outdoor home, to have a sterilized cat that's not going to roam or breed, a vaccinated cat that's not going to get sick when it's exposed to diseases. So lots of advantages of having a non-judgmental process that leads people who want a cat for any kind of home straight to our door. And I chose this question as a favorite because I had a foster cat named Freckles who just bit me every time I sat near him and peed in my laundry basket But he was so darn cute. He's orange and freckled, of course. And I fostered him about 2 years ago, and I just got a photograph of him in his outdoor home where he is so happy. And so we do have friendly cats, wonderful cats, that really thrive in an outdoor home and just weren't built to be in an indoor home. And ideally, we make those kinds of matches with people who are looking for an outdoor cat.
Thank you, Kate. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Julie, will you take this one? I know FIV2B and FIV cats can live amongst each other, but can FIV2B and FELV2B cats live together?
Thank you, Mandy. And I think our little word processor here changed positive to be, if you were wondering what that meant. So I think the question is, can these positive cats live together? And I know people who have positive cats and put them together, and if that's the choice they make, it's fine, and if it saves those cats, that's good too. If you have a choice to keep the FIV positive cats separate from the FELV cats, that is ideal, because while FIV is not very contagious, FELV still is, and co-infected cats can be co-infected with both viruses, so we'd rather segregate out the FELUC positive cats if that's possible. There is a new trend now, though, to adopting out FIV positive cats into homes with negative cats, because there's some very good research that it is incredibly rare, or almost never, that they transmit it as long as they are neutered and get along.
That's right. All right. I think that wraps up the question portion.
I will say, Mandy, I see a few people who've offered or asked for the website for ACC&D, so they can go peruse the non-surgical contraception literature, where the proceedings have just been updated today, and Joyce makes a note that it's exciting news from Harvard. So go read up on that. The website is www.acc-d.org. Lots of good stuff there.
Wonderful. All right, we're not done. Take a look at that little green widget at the bottom of your screen. Does everybody see the little green widget down there? That's how you register to join us for any one of a series of our super short 15-minute lunchtime webinars we're hosting with Maddie's, beginning 1 week from today, Thursday the 20th. Mark your calendars and join us for Power Lunch Thursdays, running all the way through November 1st. Folks, we know it's late. Before we say goodbye and you head off to bed or dinner, we just want to share some exciting news with you. We've asked you to step up tonight, and we've asked you to commit to crossing the finish line with every single cat in North America in tow. And we know you can do it because we know where we've been. And if you're ready to make change, big or small, we are always here to help. If you want to go big and make large change at your shelter, really shake things up and examine every aspect of your shelter operations, in an effort to completely optimize your life-saving operation, an in-person shelter assessment by the dynamic duo, Dr. Sarah Paisano and Cameron Moore, and a team of shelter medicine professionals might be right for your shelter. And I know what you're thinking, that sounds expensive, and it is. But once again, Maddie's has your back. Thanks to a generous grant, we're able to give away 5 tip-to-tail shelter consultations completely free. An assessment valued at $30,000 completely free. To inquire about this opportunity, to sign up for our newsletter, or if there are any other questions you think of later that we didn't cover tonight, or you just want to email us about cats, you can always reach us at #allthecats@millioncatchallenge.org. We love getting emails from you. Good night, everybody. Kate, Julie, thank you so much for everything you do, taking the time to be here with us all tonight, and thank you, Maddie.
Thank you all. Such a pleasure
Good night,
talking with you tonight.
Sweet dreams.